In the story of American slavery, most narratives begin and end with the transatlantic trade in African people. Yet hidden within the shadows of this well-documented history lies another chapter, one equally tragic and far less remembered. Between the years 1492 and 1880, historians now estimate that between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved throughout the Americas, existing alongside the 12.5 million Africans who suffered the same fate. These two systems of bondage did not operate in isolation. They intersected, overlapped, and ultimately transformed one another in ways that would shape the very foundation of racial slavery in North America. In the tobacco fields of Virginia, the rice plantations of Carolina, and the trading posts of New England, Native American and African enslaved people worked side by side. They shared their suffering. They formed families together. And they watched as colonial lawmakers created increasingly sophisticated legal frameworks to keep them bound. This is the story of how two distinct forms of servitude collided in colonial America, how one gradually replaced the other, and how this transition fundamentally altered the institution of slavery itself. It is a history that challenges our understanding of who was enslaved, when, and why, forcing us to reckon with a more complex and troubling truth about the foundations of American society. The enslavement of Native Americans by European colonists began almost immediately upon contact. As early as 1636, Native people in New England found themselves forced into servitude, sold between colonists like property. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties, established in 1641, became the first legal code in New England to formally recognize slavery. Section 91 of this document specified the conditions under which enslavement was permissible, stating that bondage could be imposed upon lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. This legal language was deliberately broad, designed to encompass both Native Americans captured in conflicts with colonial forces and Africans purchased from slave traders. The law made no initial distinction between these two groups. Both were considered outsiders, both could be held as property, and both found themselves subject to the same colonial legal framework. Meanwhile, the presence of African people in English North America followed a different trajectory. In late August of 1619, approximately 20 Angolans arrived at Point Comfort in the Virginia colony, captured from a Portuguese slave ship by English privateers. These first Africans existed in a legal gray area. Virginia possessed no clear laws sanctioning permanent slavery at that time, and many of these early African arrivals may have been treated as indentured servants rather than slaves, their bondage theoretically temporary rather than perpetual. For several decades, the status of African laborers in the colonies remained ambiguous. Some gained their freedom after years of service. Some acquired land. A few even purchased their own indentured servants. But this fluid period would not last. As tobacco cultivation expanded, as the demand for labor intensified, and as colonial populations grew, the legal landscape began to shift dramatically. The year 1662 marked a pivotal transformation. In that year, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law establishing the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, a Latin phrase meaning that which is born follows the womb. This statute decreed that any child born to an enslaved mother would inherit that status regardless of the father's condition. With this single piece of legislation, slavery became hereditary, permanent, and increasingly racialized. The children of enslaved African women would be born into bondage, generation after generation, creating a self-perpetuating system of labor exploitation. The true collision between Native American and African slavery intensified during the latter decades of the 17th century, particularly in the aftermath of King Philip's War. This conflict, which erupted in 1675, fundamentally transformed the landscape of native enslavement in New England. The war pitted Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, and his allied native nations against the expanding colonial settlements. It would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population size, and its consequences for native peoples proved catastrophic. During this war, the English colonies developed what can only be described as an industrial system for the enslavement and deportation of Native Americans. Shipping records from the period reveal a systematic operation. New England merchants routinely sent native captives to Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Azores, Spain, and even as far as Tangier in North Africa. These were not isolated incidents. They represented a deliberate policy aimed at removing native people from their homelands while simultaneously generating profit. The fate that awaited native captives who surrendered became a subject of intense debate within native communities themselves. Would surrender offer mercy and protection? Or would it lead to sale and separation from family and homeland? Contemporary evidence suggests that English colonial authorities deliberately fostered this uncertainty, sometimes offering promises of leniency to encourage surrender, only to break those promises once native people had disarmed themselves. One revealing example comes from the Saconet Confederation. Their female chief, Awashonks, agreed to ally with the English only after securing explicit assurances that her people, men, women, and children alike, would not be killed or sent overseas as slaves. This negotiation demonstrates that native leaders clearly understood the threat of foreign sale and regarded it as a fate potentially worse than death in battle. Yet even explicit promises offered no guarantee. Records from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island document cases where surrendered Native Americans, people who had explicitly been promised their freedom in exchange for laying down arms, found themselves sold into slavery regardless. By 1676, Connecticut officials had established regulations stating that terms of native servitude could be lengthened but never shortened, effectively creating a legal framework for transforming temporary bondage into permanent slavery. The human cost of this system extended across generations. In 1721, 45 years after King Philip's War ended, the Connecticut General Assembly confronted a troubling question. The Native American children who had been placed as servants in English households after the war had now grown to adulthood and had children of their own. What was to be done with this second generation? The Assembly's answer revealed the depth of colonial commitment to maintaining control over Native people. While they expressed discomfort with explicitly enslaving these children, they also refused to grant them freedom. The solution was to classify them as indentured servants, ensuring another generation of unpaid labor. During this same period, African slavery was becoming increasingly entrenched and formalized. The 1662 Virginia law establishing hereditary slavery through the maternal line spread to other colonies. Additional legislation followed, each piece further codifying the permanent, racialized nature of African bondage. Unlike Native American slavery, which often depended on military conflict and capture, African slavery was sustained by the transatlantic trade, a continuous supply of captive laborers forcibly transported from West and Central Africa. In some colonial spaces, these two systems of slavery overlapped in intimate ways. In New York and New England throughout the colonial period, Native American and African enslaved people worked side by side in the same households, on the same farms, and in the same workshops. They formed relationships, they married one another, and they created families. Because colonial law typically did not recognize these marriages as legally valid, the children born of such unions inherited the enslaved status of their mothers, whether that mother was Native American or African. These children often found themselves classified as illegitimate in colonial records, a legal designation that further marginalized them. The Carolina colonies present perhaps the most dramatic example of the transition from Native to African slavery. South Carolina, in particular, developed an extensive trade in Native American slaves during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Carolina traders ventured deep into the interior, hundreds of miles from the coast, purchasing native captives from allied tribes or capturing them directly through armed raids. By the 1720s, approximately 1,500 enslaved Native Americans lived in Carolina, out of a total colonial population of roughly 17,000. This native slave trade came to an abrupt end following the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717. This conflict erupted when the Yamasee and their allies, burdened by trade debts and angered by the exploitation inherent in the Indian slave trade, turned against the Carolina colonists. The war proved devastating for both sides, but its aftermath marked a crucial turning point. After the war concluded, South Carolina and its neighboring colonies largely ceased the large-scale enslavement of Native Americans. The trade in native captives had become too dangerous, too likely to provoke further conflicts that the colonies could ill afford. In the place of native slaves, Carolina planters turned almost exclusively to African labor. The transition from Native American to African slavery was neither sudden nor inevitable, but rather the result of deliberate calculations by colonial authorities and enslaving populations. Several factors influenced this shift. Native Americans possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain. They could more easily escape into familiar territories and find refuge with allied communities. They also retained diplomatic and military connections that made their large-scale enslavement politically dangerous, as the Yamasee War so dramatically illustrated. African captives, by contrast, arrived already separated from their homelands by an ocean. They typically lacked knowledge of the local geography, possessed no existing alliance networks in the region, and faced formidable obstacles to return. From the perspective of colonial slaveholders, these factors made African slavery appear more controllable and sustainable. Yet economic considerations also played a crucial role. The transatlantic slave trade offered a reliable, continuous supply of laborers. Native American enslavement, dependent on warfare and raids, proved inconsistent and increasingly costly as native military resistance intensified. Additionally, as laws like Virginia's 1662 statute established hereditary slavery, the reproductive capacity of enslaved African women became economically valuable. Children born to enslaved mothers represented future labor, requiring no purchase, no capture, no military campaign. The legal frameworks that emerged reflected these priorities. Laws governing slavery became increasingly race-based, constructing elaborate distinctions between white, Negro, and Indian as legal categories. These distinctions would have profound and lasting consequences, creating a hierarchical racial order that outlived slavery itself. By the middle of the 18th century, the transformation was largely complete. African slavery had become the dominant form of unfree labor throughout the British North American colonies. Native American slavery persisted in certain regions, particularly in the West and Southwest, but it no longer constituted a central economic institution in the Atlantic coastal colonies. The shift had lasting effects on both enslaved populations. For Native Americans, the legacy of enslavement compounded the devastation wrought by disease, warfare, and land dispossession. Entire communities were fractured, with some members sold overseas never to return, while others remained in colonial territories as servants or disappeared into emerging mixed-race populations that colonial authorities struggled to classify. For African Americans, the institutionalization of hereditary, racialized slavery created an immense and enduring system of oppression. The laws established during this transitional period, laws that defined slavery as a permanent, inheritable condition tied to maternal descent and racial identity. Saidiu would remain in force for more than a century. They would shape not only the institution of slavery, but also the system of racial hierarchy that succeeded it. The relationships formed between Native American and African enslaved people during this period of overlap also left an important legacy. Shared experiences of bondage created connections between these communities, connections that would persist through intermarriage, cultural exchange, and at times, coordinated resistance. The descendants of these unions would navigate complex identities in a society increasingly committed to rigid racial categories. The story of parallel enslavement in colonial America reveals uncomfortable truths about the origins of American slavery. It demonstrates that the institution was not imported whole from elsewhere, but rather constructed piece by piece through colonial legislation and practice. It shows us that slavery was not always racialized in the ways we now understand, but became so through deliberate legal and social engineering. As we continue our journey through this history, we will explore in greater depth the lives of those who endured these overlapping systems of bondage. We will examine the specific communities where Native and African enslaved people lived and worked together, the families they formed, and the strategies they employed to maintain their humanity and resist their oppression. We will see how the legacy of this early period shaped the development of slavery throughout the colonial era and into the republic that would eventually emerge. A nation built upon foundations of unfree labor from multiple sources. For now, let us turn our attention to the specific experiences of those who lived under these dual systems of bondage.